It was supposed to be just another Saturday morning. The kind where you lose yourself in chores, tinker with the car, and let the day pass without much thought. That's how I planned it, at least. The old Mustang had been giving me grief for weeks, and I finally had the time to replace the brake pads. The garage smelled of motor oil, with a hint of that cleaner I'd used earlier to scrub away the grime. The radio was on, low enough to blend into the background. The rhythmic sound of the wrench turning bolts echoed in the space, a strangely soothing backdrop to my work. Emma popped her head in from time to time, a mug of coffee in her hand. Her perfume lingered each time, light and floral, the kind of scent you could close your eyes and picture. She didn't stay long, just enough to check on me, flash me a quick smile, and disappear again. She mentioned her plans for the day, a trip to the country club with her friend Claire, followed by a bit of shopping. Routine, normal, nothing to raise an eyebrow at. I barely looked up as she spoke, nodding and murmuring an acknowledgement before diving back into my task. But then noon came around, and the air in the garage shifted. Emma walked in again, but this time she wasn't the same woman who had been flitting in and out all morning. She wore a beige dress that hugged her figure in a way that made you look twice, paired with elegant sandals that clicked softly against the garage floor. Her hair was styled, not in her usual quick ponytail or casual waves, but carefully, deliberately. She looked polished. Too polished for an afternoon with Claire. I paused, wrench in hand, and glanced at her. "You look nice," I said, keeping my tone neutral. Emma smiled, the corners of her lips curving just enough to show she'd noticed my reaction. She leaned down, kissed me on the cheek, and said, "Don't wait for me for dinner. We might stay out late." The words were simple, the tone casual, but something about them lingered. Maybe it was the way her perfume seemed heavier, or how her eyes didn't quite meet mine when she spoke. Or maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was imagining things. I didn't dwell on it. At least, not then. I went back to tightening the last bolt on the brake caliper, focusing on the task at hand. By the time I poured the brake fluid and tested the pedal, Emma was gone. The house felt quieter without her, the faint hum of the radio in the background now almost too soft to fill the space. I shrugged it off. People dress up sometimes. That's all it was, right? She and Claire probably had some fancy lunch spot in mind, a place where the waiters wore ties and the menu didn't have prices. Women like that kind of thing. I convinced myself it wasn't worth a second thought. But as the hours stretched on and the sun dipped lower in the sky, I found myself thinking about that dress, those sandals, and the way she said not to wait for her. Looking back, I think that was the first crack in the foundation. Small, almost imperceptible, the kind you don't notice until it starts to spread. But at the time, I didn't know any of that. I just figured it was another Saturday, and Emma was doing what Emma did, living her life, just as I was living mine. If only it had stayed that simple. If only I hadn't started paying attention. Maybe then, everything would have stayed intact, and I wouldn't have found myself standing in the wreckage of what used to be our life. But cracks have a way of growing, don't they? And sometimes, all it takes is one small moment to start pulling at the thread that unravels everything. Sunday mornings in our house were usually quiet. Emma liked to sleep in, and I used the time to catch up on odds and ends around the house. That day, I decided to tackle the growing pile of laundry that had been threatening to spill out of the basket. I didn't think much of it. Laundry was laundry, a mindless task to keep me busy until Emma woke up and we could share breakfast. I sorted through the clothes like usual. T-shirts, jeans, Emma's blouses, until something caught my eye. It was subtle at first, a texture that didn't belong among the familiar fabrics. I pulled it out, holding it up to the light. A black silk tie. Smooth, expensive, and entirely out of place in my world. I frowned. It wasn't mine. I didn't even own a tie like this. I turned it over in my hands, looking for a clue. A brand tag, initials, something that would explain how it ended up in my house. Nothing. It was pristine, The kind of tie you'd wear with a tailored suit. I tried to recall the last time anyone dressed like that had been here, but the answer eluded me. We didn't host fancy dinner parties. Our circle was casual, jeans and sneakers types. The tie didn't belong. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it had been left behind after some long-forgotten gathering. Or maybe Emma borrowed it for a reason I couldn't fathom. It wasn't unusual for her to help friends plan events or pick up stray items. But still, something about it nagged at me. I hung it on the edge of the laundry room cabinet and walked away. It didn't feel worth confronting her about. Not yet. I wasn't the kind of guy to make a scene over something so trivial. But the thought lingered. Every time I passed the laundry room, the tie was there. A quiet reminder that I didn't have an answer. Later that evening, Emma came home. She seemed relaxed, glowing even, like someone who had spent the day unwinding. We sat in the living room, her scrolling through her phone while I flipped aimlessly through TV channels. The tie was still on my mind, so I decided to ask casually, as if it had only just occurred to me. "Hey, do you know where that tie came from? The one in the laundry?" Her eyes flicked toward the laundry room, and for a brief moment, a split second, her brow creased. It was subtle, the kind of thing most people wouldn't catch. Then she laughed, light and easy. "Oh, that's James. We were helping him prepare for his anniversary party last week. I must have accidentally thrown it in my bag." The answer was smooth. Practiced, almost. But not unbelievable. James was a mutual friend, the kind of guy who would wear a tie like that. It made sense. Yet something in her tone didn't sit right with me. I nodded, letting it go. "Makes sense," I said, keeping my voice even. But as she turned back to her phone, I couldn't help but notice how quickly the crease in her brow had disappeared. Like a door closing, shutting off whatever had been there for that brief, fleeting moment. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the tie, about her answer, about the way her laugh had felt just a little too light, her explanation a little too polished. It wasn't enough to accuse her of anything, but it was enough to plant a seed. Looking back, it's strange how something so small can hold so much weight. A tie. Just a piece of fabric. But in that moment, it became something more. A question I couldn't shake. A mystery that felt like it might grow if I didn't keep an eye on it. I told myself to let it go. To trust her. But trust is a fragile thing. And once it's cracked, no matter how small the crack, you can't help but wonder when it'll shatter. By the following weekend, I thought the tie was behind me. Emma had offered an explanation, and there was no concrete reason to doubt her. But something about that moment, the faint crease in her brow, the practiced tone of her answer, stayed lodged in the back of my mind like a splinter. And it wasn't long before another oddity surfaced. It started innocently enough. We had planned a picnic, one of those rare moments where life slows down and you get to enjoy the little things. I decided to clean out Emma's car to make room for the cooler and blankets. I figured I'd find the usual suspects. Reusable grocery bags, stray receipts, and maybe an old coffee cup. Instead, I found something I couldn't ignore. Tucked into the corner of the trunk, partially hidden beneath an umbrella, was a small velvet box. My heart did a strange little lurch as I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected, the kind of weight that suggests value. Slowly, I opened it. Inside were a pair of gold cufflinks, polished to a mirror shine. They were engraved with the initials AR. I stared at them for a long moment, my mind racing. They were elegant, the kind of accessory a man would wear to a high-end business meeting or a black tie event. Definitely not mine. And while Emma was meticulous about her things, this wasn't something she'd casually toss in her trunk. Who was AR? I closed the box, my fingers lingering on the velvet. Should I confront her right away? Number not yet. I needed to think, to process. So I put the box back exactly where I found it and went about cleaning the car as if nothing had happened. That night, the cufflinks gnawed at me. When we were in bed, lights off and the room bathed in the faint glow of the street lamp outside, I decided to bring them up. My voice was casual, almost disinterested. "I found cufflinks in your car today," I said into the dark. Emma shifted beside me, propping herself up on one elbow. Her silhouette was calm, but her voice carried a faint edge of surprise. "Cufflinks?" she repeated, as if she hadn't heard me right. "Oh, those must be Richard's. We were organizing an auction at work, and he asked me to hold on to them. I forgot they were there." Her explanation was quick, smooth, too smooth. But there was nothing in her tone that hinted at panic. If anything, she sounded slightly annoyed at herself for being forgetful. I couldn't find a crack in her story, so I nodded. "Makes sense," I said, rolling onto my back. But it didn't make sense. Not entirely. The box had been in the trunk, buried under other items. If she was holding on to them for a work event, why not keep them in her office or somewhere more accessible? And why hadn't she mentioned them until now? Over the next few days, I started noticing patterns. Little things. Her phone, which she used to leave face up on the counter, was now always face down. She began staying out later, often citing vague excuses about work or last-minute plans with friends. When I asked about her day, her answers were polished but brief, as if she were reading from a script. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was stringing together unrelated events to create a story that wasn't there. But each new inconsistency felt like another thread being pulled from the fabric of our life together. Then, there was the gym. Emma had always been diligent about staying fit, but her routine became more erratic. Extra trips on weekdays, spontaneous sessions on weekends. When I offered to join her for a class, she laughed and said it was her alone time. None of it was damning on its own. A tie, cufflinks, extra gym visits. But together, they started forming a picture I didn't want to see. I found myself retracing her steps in my mind, replaying conversations, analyzing her tone of voice. There was nothing concrete to confront her with, but the distance between us was growing. I wasn't the kind of man to jump to conclusions, but I wasn't stupid either. Emma had always been an open book, but now it felt like she was writing entire chapters without me. The trust that had once been the foundation of our marriage was beginning to crack. And the thing about cracks? They only get bigger if you ignore them. By this point, I couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at me. Something was off. Emma's explanations were always neat and polished, almost rehearsed, and though they aligned with the evidence, they left a bitter aftertaste. It wasn't jealousy, and it wasn't paranoia. It was something deeper, an instinct I couldn't silence. But I wasn't ready to confront her outright. If I was going to take that step, I needed proof. Real, undeniable proof. I decided to proceed carefully, methodically. Emma was sharp, and if she was hiding something, she was doing it masterfully. One misstep on my part could ruin everything. I started with a simple, subtle test. One evening, Emma told me she'd be out with Claire again, this time for dinner at a restaurant they frequented. It sounded routine, nothing out of the ordinary. But I decided to call her about 45 minutes after she left, under the pretense of needing her help finding something. "Hey, Emma," I said, keeping my voice casual. "Sorry to bother you, but I can't find the kitchen renovation contract. Do you remember where it is?" There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to make me wonder if I'd caught her off guard. Then, her tone softened, steady as always. "Oh, it's in the blue folder in the hallway drawer. You must have missed it." I listened carefully, not just to her voice, but to the background noise. I could hear the faint hum of conversations, the occasional clink of glass, and soft music, exactly what you'd expect at a restaurant. Everything checked out. She even asked if I'd eaten dinner, a thoughtful question that seemed to reaffirm her innocence. But just as I was about to hang up, I caught something. A male voice, faint but distinct, said, "Hey, Emma, everything okay?" I froze. It wasn't a big deal, not really. Maybe a waiter or another diner nearby. But the familiarity in his tone didn't sit right with me. The next day, I checked the drawer she'd mentioned. The contract was there, exactly where she said it would be. Everything lined up. Yet that voice still lingered in my mind. The second phase of my plan required a little more effort. I had a GPS tracker, something I used during road trips to avoid getting lost. It was small, discreet, and easy to install. That morning, while Emma was in the shower, I slipped it into the trunk of her car, hidden under the carpet. It was secure, almost invisible, and linked to an app on my phone. That evening, when Emma left for another supposed outing with Claire, I opened the app and watched her route. At first, everything seemed normal. She drove directly to the restaurant where they often met. For about 2 hours, the car remained stationary. Then, as the third hour ticked by, the car started moving again. This time, the tracker showed her heading toward a quiet residential area. I knew the area well. It wasn't near any restaurants, shops, or landmarks. My pulse quickened as I stared at the blinking dot on the screen. When Emma came home later that night, I tried to sound as casual as possible. "How was dinner? Did you stop anywhere else afterward?" She smiled, her expression as calm as ever. "Oh, yes. Tara forgot her phone at the restaurant, so we had to circle around the neighborhood looking for it. Can you imagine? 10 minutes of driving in circles before we found it." Her explanation was flawless, matching the route I'd seen on the tracker. Every stop, every turn, it all added up. Yet something still felt off. The third part of my plan involved one of the most basic senses: smell. Emma had a favorite silk shawl she wore whenever she went out in the evening, but this time, she left without it. When she came home, her dress carried a faint, unfamiliar scent. Not her usual perfume, but something musky, distinctly masculine. "Did something happen?" I asked, feigning concern. "You smell different." Emma laughed softly. "Oh, the waiter spilled some cologne on me while clearing the table. Clumsy guy." Her answer was quick, but my gut told me otherwise. The inconsistencies, the vague explanations, they were all starting to add up. Each piece of the puzzle seemed innocent on its own, but together, they painted a picture I couldn't ignore. Emma was hiding something. I didn't know what it was yet, but I was determined to find out. The next step wasn't just about gathering more evidence. It was about escalation. If she was going to keep secrets, I was going to uncover them. And I wasn't going to do it alone. I don't know what was worse: the doubts that kept circling in my head, or the growing realization that I was actively trying to find something. It's strange, isn't it? How a part of you hopes you're wrong, that it's all in your head, while another part keeps telling you to dig deeper. By now, though, it was no longer just about the tie, the cufflinks, or the faint smell of cologne. It was about Emma herself. The little shifts in her behavior, the way her responses felt rehearsed, the sense of distance creeping into our conversations. I decided it was time to bring in reinforcements. Not the kind who would gossip or tell me to jump to conclusions, but people I trusted. Men who had stood by me through thick and thin. I needed fresh eyes, perspectives that weren't clouded by the emotions I was wrestling with. Ethan was the first to come to mind. He was my best friend from college, a guy who could pick apart a situation like a detective in a crime novel. Then there was Noah, my neighbor, who owed me a favor after I helped him save thousands by repairing his roof last summer. Lastly, Victor, a former military man whose instincts were sharper than anyone I knew. He still owed me for a loan I'd given him for his sister's emergency surgery. Together, they formed a team I could trust. When I explained everything to them, we were standing in my garage, the air thick with the smell of motor oil and faint cigarette smoke. I laid it all out: the tie, the cufflinks, the tracker, the strange scent, and Emma's polished responses. "I'm not saying she's doing anything," I began, keeping my voice steady. "But something doesn't add up, and I need to know what's going on." Ethan was the first to speak. "You're doing the right thing, man. If she's hiding something, we'll find out. If not, at least you'll have peace of mind. Noah nodded. But we've got to be smart about this. No amateur sleuthing or obvious moves. Victor crossed his arms, his face unreadable. Subtlety is key. Let her think she's in control while we gather the pieces. Their words were reassuring, but the road ahead still felt uncertain. I wasn't a man prone to paranoia, but this situation was testing my limits. I needed clarity, and they were going to help me get it. Our first move was simple: surveillance. Ethan had a drone, a quiet model with a long battery life and an excellent camera. If Emma's outings involved more than what she was telling me, we'd see it. Mark operated the drone like a pro, keeping a safe distance as Emma's car pulled into a high-end restaurant parking lot one evening. At first, everything seemed normal. She met a group of people dressed sharply, likely colleagues. But then she stepped out onto the terrace alone, her face tense as she spoke into her phone. The drone's camera couldn't pick up audio over the background noise, but her hand gestures were telling, subtle but urgent, as if she were trying to explain something important. Meanwhile, Noah played his part on the ground. Armed with a leash and his enormous Great Dane, Max, he strolled casually around the restaurant's perimeter. A guy walking his dog in an upscale neighborhood didn't draw much attention. He managed to overhear snippets of Emma's conversation. "No, I can't right now. It's too risky. We need to finish this by Friday." The tone wasn't romantic. It wasn't affectionate. If anything, Emma sounded scared. It raised more questions than answers. Victor, ever the strategist, took the next step. Using a fake name and a polished persona, he scheduled an appointment at Emma's workplace, posing as a potential client. He observed her closely during a meeting with her boss, Caleb. Their conversation was quiet, but Victor caught enough to understand the stakes were high. Phrases like, "If this gets out, the company won't survive," stood out. Whatever was happening, it wasn't petty. It was serious. We regrouped in my garage that night, the air heavy with unanswered questions. Each of us had brought back pieces of the puzzle, but the full picture still eluded us. Victor summarized it best. This isn't just about an affair. Whatever she's caught up in, it's bigger than that. Bigger. The word settled in my chest like a weight. For the first time, I wondered if Emma was in over her head, if she was a victim of something she couldn't control. Or worse, if she was an active participant. One thing was clear. I couldn't stop now. I had to know the truth, no matter where it led. And this was just the beginning. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but they didn't make a complete picture. Yet, the tie, the cufflinks, the faint male voice, the cryptic snippets of conversation overheard at the restaurant. None of it screamed outright betrayal, but it didn't sit right either. It was as though Emma had built a carefully curated facade, and no matter how polished it seemed, tiny cracks were beginning to form. Victor's observation from her workplace stuck with me. If this gets out, the company won't survive. Those words echoed in my head. What could be so damaging, so dangerous, that it had both Emma and her boss, Caleb, speaking in hushed tones behind closed doors? And why did Emma look so tense when she thought no one was watching? I decided it was time for more direct action. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet, but I needed to get closer, to observe her in her natural environment without her knowing. That's when Ethan came through with an idea. "I've got something for you," he said one night as we gathered in the garage. He pulled out a sleek velvet box and opened it. Inside was a pen, polished, elegant, and entirely unassuming. "It's not just a pen," he explained, turning it over to reveal a tiny, nearly invisible camera embedded near the clip. "Give her this. Say it's a corporate gift or something. She'll never suspect it." It was perfect, a simple, unobtrusive way to keep an eye on her office interactions. The next morning, I left it on the kitchen counter with a note. "Thought you'd like this for work. Looks professional. R." When Emma saw it, she smiled, thanked me, and tucked it into her bag without a second thought. That evening, as I reviewed the footage with Ethan and Noah, my stomach tightened. The camera was angled slightly askew, capturing only part of her desk and the doorway. At first, the day's activity seemed routine. Emma typing away on her laptop, taking calls, and occasionally glancing at her phone. But then Caleb walked in. The energy in the room shifted instantly. He didn't knock. He simply entered, closing the door behind him. Emma's body stiffened, her fingers pausing mid-typing. Caleb leaned over her desk, his voice low but firm. The camera didn't pick up every word, but it caught enough to send a chill down my spine. "You understand what's at stake," Caleb said, his tone sharp. "This isn't optional, Emma." Her voice, when she finally responded, was quiet, hesitant. "I know, but I'm running out of time. I don't want to do this." "You don't have a choice," Caleb snapped, cutting her off. "If Alex finds out—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Emma turned her face away from the camera, but her shoulders slumped as though the weight of the world had just settled on them. Caleb straightened, smoothing his tie. "You'll do what needs to be done. You don't want this getting out any more than I do." With that, he left, closing the door behind him. Emma remained seated, her head in her hands, her body trembling ever so slightly. The footage ended there, but it was more than enough. My mind raced with questions. What didn't Emma want me to find out? What was Caleb holding over her? And why did it seem like she was trapped in something much bigger than just the two of us? I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to demand answers and lay it all bare. But the other part, the rational, calculating part, knew better. I needed more. If I was going to confront Emma, I couldn't go in half-cocked. I needed something undeniable. The next day, I called Victor. "She's in over her head," I said. "But I still don't know how much of this is her doing." Victor didn't miss a beat. "Then we keep digging. No assumptions, no accusations, just the facts." And so we pressed on, determined to uncover the truth, no matter how messy or painful it turned out to be. The cracks in Emma's facade were widening, and soon I knew the whole thing would come crashing down. I just wasn't sure if I was ready for what I might find. The footage of Caleb and Emma's tense exchange played on a loop in my mind. I could no longer convince myself this was about a simple misunderstanding or a coincidence. The weight of their words. "If Alex finds out," pressed down on me like a lead blanket. I didn't know whether Emma was a victim or an accomplice. But the time for wondering was over. I needed answers, and I needed them now. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Emma had left her laptop open in the living room one evening after working late. It was an uncharacteristic move. She usually logged out or took her devices to the bedroom. I waited until she went upstairs to shower, then quietly sat down at the coffee table. My hands hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly as I debated whether to cross this line. I told myself it wasn't snooping. It was the pursuit of the truth, a necessary step to preserve whatever trust might still exist between us. I clicked on her messaging app, my heart pounding in my ears. The chat window with Caleb was already open, the most recent messages staring back at me like a slap in the face. Caleb asked, "Are you sure about tomorrow? You can still back out." Emma replied, "No. I've made up my mind. I want to move forward." Caleb said again, "The hotel is booked. Room 213. I'll meet you there at 7. And Emma replied, "Understood. I'll be there." The words hit me like a freight train. There was no ambiguity here, no wiggle room for doubt. Emma wasn't being manipulated. She was actively participating. Whatever was going on, she had chosen this path willingly. I snapped a picture of the screen with my phone, then carefully closed the laptop and returned it to its original position. I sat back on the couch, staring at nothing, as the realization settled in. She wasn't just hiding something. She was actively deceiving me. The next day, I began preparing for the inevitable confrontation. I couldn't go in blindly, fueled by anger. That would only lead to chaos. No, I needed a plan, a methodical, calculated approach. This wasn't just about satisfying my curiosity anymore. It was about protecting myself, my home, and everything I had worked for. I installed a small camera in Emma's car, carefully tucking it into the dashboard's plastic lining. It was nearly invisible, and with the live feed linked to my phone, I could watch her movements in real time. That evening, when she said she was heading out for a work meeting, I waited until she left and then opened the app. Emma's route was predictable at first. She drove straight to a high-end restaurant downtown, parking in a secluded corner of the lot. Moments later, Caleb appeared, walking briskly to her car and climbing into the passenger seat. My pulse quickened as I watched their interaction unfold. The audio was faint but clear enough to hear the tension in their voices. Caleb said, "Are you sure about this? There's no going back after tonight." Emma replied, "I'm sure. I've been waiting for this for too long." The kiss that followed was brief but unmistakable. She was the one who initiated it, leaning toward him without hesitation. My stomach churned as I watched them pull away, their faces lit with a mix of determination and guilt. They drove off together, the camera tracking their route to a luxury hotel across town. I didn't need to follow them. I already knew where they were going and what would happen next. But I wasn't done yet. Earlier that day, I had arranged for a hidden recording device to be placed in room 213, tucked neatly into a decorative lamp. If there were any lingering doubts about Emma's intentions, this would settle them once and for all. Hours later, sitting in the garage with my phone connected to the recording device, I listened to their conversation. The sound was crystal clear, every word cutting deeper than the last. Caleb texted Emma saying, "Why did it take you so long to agree to this?" Emma replied, "Alex doesn't see me anymore. I'm just there, part of his routine. But with you, I feel alive." He told her, "You could have just left him." And she replied that, "It's not that simple. I don't want to hurt him. This is easier." That final sentence broke something inside me. This is easier. As though betraying me, lying to me, and dragging our marriage through the mud was a matter of convenience. I ended the recording and stared at the screen in silence. I had everything I needed. Proof of her lies, her actions, and her choices. There was no longer any room for doubt. The woman I thought I knew, the life I thought we shared, was gone. That night, I couldn't look at Emma the same way. Every word she spoke felt hollow, every smile a mask hiding the truth. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. If I was going to do this, I was going to do it on my terms. The cracks in our marriage had widened into a chasm, and soon, everything would collapse. But when it did, it would be on my timeline. I wasn't going to lash out or lose control. I was going to expose her lies with precision, leaving no room for excuses. And believe me, when the time came, she wouldn't see it coming. If I was going to confront her, it needed to be methodical, undeniable, and inescapable. Then she handed me the perfect opportunity. "We're hosting a small corporate party this Friday," she announced over dinner. "Just a few colleagues, nothing too elaborate. Can you help me set up?" Her request came with a smile, the kind of smile that might have softened me in the past. But now it felt rehearsed, calculated. I forced myself to smile back. "Of course, whatever you need." Inside, I couldn't believe the audacity. She was bringing Caleb into my home. Into our home. If she thought this party would be her safe haven, she was wrong. This wasn't going to be a celebration. It was going to be an unveiling. The day of the party, I worked quietly but deliberately, making sure everything was ready, not for her guests, but for my plan. I transferred all the evidence, the messages, the recordings, the footage, to a secure flash drive. Then I set up the living room TV to display the contents with the press of a button. I didn't want a screaming match or a chaotic scene. I wanted the truth to speak for itself. By the time the guests arrived, the house was buzzing with laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of polite conversation. Emma floated through the room, charming everyone with her smile and effortless grace. She looked radiant, like the woman I'd fallen in love with years ago. But now I saw it for what it was. A performance. Then I saw him. Caleb. He was standing near the drinks table, casually chatting with a group of coworkers. His confidence was palpable, his smile smug. My fists clenched involuntarily, but I forced myself to remain calm. I watched as Emma drifted toward him, her demeanor subtly shifting. She leaned in close, her hand brushing his arm as she whispered something in his ear. He laughed softly, the sound grating against my nerves. It was time. I stepped into the center of the room and clinked a glass to get everyone's attention. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward me. Emma's gaze lingered on me, her expression curious but calm. Caleb's smile faltered ever so slightly. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steady. Emma told me this would be a night to remember, and she was right. I'd like to share something with you all, a little insight into the kind of connections we've built here. I picked up the remote and pressed the button. The TV sprang to life, displaying a series of screenshots from Emma's chat with Caleb. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The messages were damning, every word painting a picture of deception and betrayal. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and I turned to see Emma frozen in place, her face drained of color. Caleb, on the other hand, was trying to edge toward the door. "I'm not done," I said, my voice sharp. "Let's move on to the next part." The screen shifted to the footage from the dashboard camera. Their kiss in Emma's car, their conversation about the hotel. The audience's shock turned to murmurs, and then whispers. Finally, I played the audio recording from the hotel room. Emma's voice filled the room, confessing how she felt alive with Caleb, how I had become just part of her routine. Her words echoed like a funeral bell, marking the end of everything we'd built together. Emma's face crumbled as the last recording ended. Her carefully constructed persona shattered in front of her colleagues, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. Caleb's expression was a mix of anger and panic, his smug confidence gone. "Alex," Emma began, stepping toward me. "Please, let me explain." "Explain what?" I snapped, cutting her off. "Explain how you lied to me? How you brought him into my home, into our life?" "No, Emma, you don't get to explain. You've already said enough." I turned to Caleb. "Get out of my house, now." He didn't argue. He grabbed his coat and bolted for the door, shoving past stunned guests on his way out. As the murmurs in the room grew louder, I addressed the guests. "The party's over. You're all welcome to leave." One by one, they filed out, some offering awkward apologies, others avoiding my gaze. Emma stood in the center of the room, tears streaming down her face, her shoulders trembling. When the last guest had left, I turned to her. "You destroyed us, Emma," I said, my voice cold. "You destroyed everything, and now you'll face the consequences." I didn't wait for her response. I walked upstairs, leaving her standing alone in the wreckage of the life we had built together. That night, I slept in the guest room, my heart heavy but my resolve unshaken. The next day, I contacted my lawyer. This wasn't just about divorce. It was about making sure she couldn't take anything else from me. And I was just getting started. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. The confrontation had laid everything bare, but it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. I sat at the kitchen table, the house eerily silent, sipping my coffee and planning my next move. Emma had spent the night in the master bedroom. I didn't hear her come downstairs, and I didn't care. She was no longer my concern, not in the way she used to be. I called Lucas Hayes, a divorce attorney with a reputation as ruthless as he was brilliant. When I laid out my case and presented the evidence I had collected, the messages, recordings, and footage, Lucas leaned back in his chair, a smirk curling his lips. "This isn't just a case," he said. "This is a complete obliteration. We'll freeze all joint assets immediately, secure the house, and ensure she walks away with nothing. You want justice, Alex? You'll get it." Lucas wasted no time. By the end of the day, Emma's access to our joint accounts was frozen. Her credit cards were declined at the gas station, and her phone call to me later that afternoon was laced with panic. "Alex, what's going on? I can't access any money. My cards aren't working." "You made your choice, Emma," I said, cutting her off. "This is the beginning of the consequences." I hung up without another word. My voice had been calm, steady, but inside, I felt a storm brewing. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about reclaiming control over a life she had so thoroughly disrupted. Lucas had another ace up his sleeve, the professional implications of Emma and Caleb's affair. He compiled a detailed report, complete with every piece of evidence, and sent it directly to the board of directors at their company. The corporate world is a ruthless place, and scandals like this aren't just frowned upon. They're career-ending. Within days, Caleb was summoned to an emergency meeting. According to Lucas's sources, the chairman didn't mince words. "You've violated our code of conduct, misused your authority, and jeopardized the integrity of this company. You're terminated, effective immediately." There was no severance package, no soft landing. Caleb left the building with a single box of his personal belongings, his reputation in tatters. Emma wasn't spared either. Although she wasn't fired outright, she was suspended indefinitely pending an internal review. In the corporate world, a suspension like that is just a polite precursor to being let go. Her professional life, much like her personal one, was crumbling around her. The courtroom became our final battleground. In our state, adultery was still a significant factor in divorce proceedings, and Lucas made sure every damning piece of evidence was presented. The messages, the recordings, and the footage all entered into public record. The details of Emma's betrayal were laid bare for everyone to see. When the judge delivered the final verdict, it was a clean sweep. The house was awarded to me, along with all our joint bank accounts and investments. Emma was denied alimony, and she was ordered to cover all legal fees associated with the case. She left the courtroom with nothing, no home, no money, and no safety net. But Lucas wasn't done. He suggested, and I agreed, that the evidence should remain in open court, accessible to anyone who cared to look. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers could read Emma's words, hear her voice, and see the footage that had exposed her lies. The whispers began almost immediately, and her polished image disintegrated under the weight of public scrutiny. A few weeks later, Emma showed up at the house that was now mine. She stood on the porch, clutching a small suitcase, her face pale and tear-streaked. I stepped outside, holding a cup of coffee, and leaned against the doorframe. "Alex, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know where to go. I'm so sorry." I looked at her for a long moment, my expression unreadable. Then I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch. "I don't care about your regrets, Emma," I said finally, my tone as cold as the winter wind. "You made your choice. Now live with it." She opened her mouth to say something else, but I turned and shut the door in her face. The sound of the latch clicking into place felt final, like the closing of a chapter I never wanted to read again. I stood in the quiet of my home, staring out the window as Emma's figure disappeared down the driveway. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. The love I had once felt for her was gone, replaced by a cold resolve to rebuild my life on my terms. She had destroyed everything we had, but I hadn't let her win. I had taken back control, piece by piece, and ensured that her betrayal would follow her for the rest of her life. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel sorrow. All I felt was the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served. And as I sat back in my chair, sipping my coffee, I realized I didn't just survive the storm. I had weathered it. And now, I was free.